The lab at 10 p.m. is a vacuum of sound. Just the low hum of ventilation recycling sterile air. I was focused on the titration curve when Dr. Kinsley Jones moved into my space. Usually, she's a ghost, silent, distant, but tonight she leaned over my shoulder to verify the pH strip, close enough to feel her heat. Then she froze. Her breath hitched, a sharp inhale near my neck. For 2 years, she's been a statue of composure. In that second, the statue cracked. The scent of midnight amber, my contraband soap, hung between us, turning a safety check into something dangerous. The Jones Institute of Dermatology and Formulation is built like a cathedral to hygiene. It's all white Italian tile, brushed chrome surfaces, and glass partitions that stretch up to the vaulted ceilings. The air always smells of nothing. Literally nothing. It's scrubbed with hospital-grade antiseptic every 4 hours, leaving a scent profile that is aggressively neutral. It's a place designed to erase the human element, to reduce biology to its chemical components. And presiding over this kingdom of sterility is Dr. Kinsley Jones. The junior staff call her the cold process behind her back. It's a soap-making term, referring to a method that requires patience, precision, and low temperatures to cure properly, resulting in a product that is hard, lasting, and pure. It fits her perfectly. Kinsley is brilliant, the kind of lipid chemist who sees molecular structures where the rest of us just see cream. But she's untouchable. She speaks in data points, directives, and the occasional sharp correction. I've seen her dismantle a senior researcher's hypothesis with 3 sentences and a raised eyebrow, never once raising her voice. She is a study in absolute control, her movements efficient and deliberate, like a surgeon or a bomb disposal expert. To watch her is to watch a master at work, but it's also like watching a glacier. Beautiful, massive, and capable of crushing anything that gets too close. I am the invisible machinery that keeps her world running. As a junior technician, my job is to be everywhere and nowhere. I prep the beakers, sterilize the spatulas, and ensure that when she reaches for a pipette, it is exactly where her hand expects it to be. I move around her like a satellite in a fixed orbit, close enough to feel the gravitational pull of her intensity, but never close enough to burn. For 2 years, our interactions have been limited to the transfer of data and equipment. Viscosity check, 3 minutes, she'd say, not looking up. Understood, doctor, I'd reply. It was a dance of perfect professional silence. But silence allows for observation. While she focused on the microscope, I focused on her. I watched the way her hands worked, steady, capable, devoid of wasted motion. There is a specific kind of intimacy in watching someone who is truly excellent at what they do. I memorized the rhythm of her work, the way she taps the side of a beaker twice to settle the solution, the slight furrow of her brow when the data doesn't align with her predictions. I found myself admiring the architecture of her discipline, the way she held herself against the chaos of variables. She was a fortress, impenetrable and impressive, and I was just the moss growing quietly on the outer wall, absorbing the ambient heat of her brilliance without ever daring to ask for a spark. The lab rules are explicit about contaminants, and that includes us. We scrub in like surgeons. No perfume, no scented lotions, no laundry detergent with strong fragrances. We are supposed to be olfactory voids. Entering the clean room means stripping away the outside world, leaving your personality in the locker room, along with your street clothes. Scent is information, and in formulation, uncontrolled information is noise. Bringing a personal smell into Kinsley's lab is worse than being late. It's a contamination of the data. It's a violation of the cold process protocol. So, I became a void. I scrubbed my skin raw with the unscented industrial soap provided in the locker room. I kept my head down. I became the perfect, scentless instrument she required. The routine was safe. It was predictable. It was lonely, in a way that felt almost holy. I thought I could exist in her orbit forever without ever colliding with the planet itself. I thought the silence was permanent. But chemistry is all about reactions, and reactions happen when stability is compromised. The routine held, solid and unyielding. Right up until the night, the anti-aging emulsion refused to stabilize, and the ventilation system couldn't quite scrub the air fast enough. We were chasing a ghost. Project Ether. The board called it the future of the company, but in the lab, it was just the difficult emulsion. It was a high-stakes lipid barrier repair complex, intended to mimic the skin's natural ceramides so perfectly that the body couldn't tell the difference. But the chemistry was fighting us. The formula was unstable, prone to phase separation the moment the temperature fluctuated by a fraction of a degree. For 6 months, we had been trying to force oil and water to marry. And for 6 months, they had been divorcing violently in the centrifuge. The failure was expensive, but the silence it created in the lab was costing us something else entirely. It was a daily erosion of confidence, a slow grind that turned the lab into a pressure vessel. To survive the relentless, bleaching sterility of the Jones Institute, I developed a private rebellion. It wasn't loud. It didn't violate the NDA. It was a bar of soap. I found it in a small, cluttered apothecary in the West Village, a place that smelled of dried sage and history. The soap was a rough-cut block of dark gold called midnight amber. It was the antithesis of the lab. Where the Institute smelled of ionized air and ethanol, this soap smelled of deep, creamy sandalwood, dark, fossilized resin, and a sharp, distinct note of wood smoke. It was complex, messy, and deeply organic. It smelled like a cabin in the woods during a storm, safe and warm and alive. It was the smell of a life lived with dirt under the fingernails, not latex gloves. It was a sensory anchor that kept me from floating away into the white void of the workday. Every morning, I performed my double life. I would stand in the steam of my shower, lathering that rich, spicy scent into my skin, breathing it in like oxygen. It was a grounding ritual, a way to remind myself that I was a biological entity, not just a pair of hands in a nitrile glove. Then I would rinse it off. I would take the mandated, unscented clinical scrub and wash away the evidence, scouring until I was neutral again. But fragrance is tricky physics. You can wash away the top notes, the smoke, the sharp spice, but the base notes are heavy molecules. They sink into the lipid layer of the skin, binding with the body's own heat. They wait. I walked into work every day thinking I was clean, but carrying the ghost of sandalwood on my pulse points, a secret signal waiting for a receiver sensitive enough to pick it up. Kinsley was fraying. The cold process was showing stress fractures. She never snapped, never threw things, but the silence around her grew heavier, denser. I watched her stare at the separation in the test tubes with a look of quiet devastation. The tension in the lab was physical. It felt like the air pressure had dropped before a tornado. I saw the way her jaw would lock tight while she typed, the muscles working under the skin. I saw her rub the bridge of her nose, eyes closed, trying to reset her brain against the exhaustion. She looked like a statue that was slowly vibrating apart. It was terrifying to witness because it meant she was human, and if she was human, she could break. It was in those moments that the professional distance felt most like a cage. I wanted to do something human. I wanted to put a hand on her shoulder, to break the sterile field, to offer some kind of warmth that wasn't generated by a hot plate. I found myself tracking her movements with an intensity that bordered on obsession, cataloging her signs of distress. I wanted to be the emulsifier that held her together when the stress was trying to pull her apart. But I stayed in my lane. I stayed silent, watching the way the fluorescent light washed her out. I kept my hands to myself and my scent hidden under layers of caution, terrified that if I reached out, I wouldn't just break protocol. I would break the delicate balance that kept us functioning. The deadline for the final stability test was 8 a.m. Saturday. That meant Friday night was the gauntlet. We had one last batch, one last modification to the heating curve. The institute emptied out around us, the lights in the other labs clicking off one by one, leaving us alone in the glowing white heart of the building. The ventilation hummed louder in the emptiness, recycling the air, pulling us into a tighter and tighter loop. The world narrowed down to two people, a centrifuge spinning at 3,000 RPM, and the invisible, lingering trace of amber that I thought I had washed away, waiting for the heat of the moment to release it back into the air. By 11 p.m., the building automation had surrendered to the night, dimming the overhead banks in the corridor until our lab felt like a pressurized capsule drifting in deep space. The only illumination came from the focused task lights under the fume hoods and the cold blue glow of the monitors. The world outside the glass partitions had ceased to exist. There was no traffic, no city hum, just the rhythmic, hypnotic thrum of the high-speed centrifuge spinning down and the intermittent click of Kinsley's stylus against her tablet. We had entered a state of flow that felt less like work and more like a trance. The difficult emulsion was in the final cooling phase. This was the critical window where the lipid structures either aligned into a perfect silky lattice or collapsed into a separated mess of oil and water. Kinsley was monitoring the viscosity readout, her posture rigid, eyes tracking the micro fluctuations on the screen. I was managing the physical samples, moving between the incubator and the analysis station. We were a single organism with two sets of hands, moving in a silence that was absolute but not empty. It was filled with the tension of the work, a shared frequency of focus that I had come to crave more than sleep. I needed the micropipette to transfer the sample to a slide. It was sitting on the rack to her right, just past the edge of her workspace. In the daylight, with the full staff present, I would have walked around the island to retrieve it. But in the intimacy of the late hour, with exhaustion blurring the edges of protocol, I took the shortcut. I reached across the gap. I miscalculated. At the exact moment I extended my arm, Kinsley shifted her weight, leaning back to rub the tension from her neck. It wasn't a collision, it was barely a graze. My forearm brushed against her upper arm, the heavy cotton of my lab coat sliding against the starch of hers. The contact lasted less than a second, a fleeting friction of fabric on fabric. But in a room defined by sterility and distance, it felt like a structural failure. I felt the heat of her body radiating through the layers, a sudden, shocking warmth in a room kept at a constant 68 degrees. I flinched back immediately, my hand retracting as if I'd touched a live wire. "Sorry," I murmured, the words stumbling out, barely audible over the ventilation. I just needed the movement. The sudden jerk of my arm, the flush of heat that spiked through my chest and radiated off my skin, acted like a bellows. The air displacement pushed the atmosphere around my body directly into her personal space. And despite the scrub, despite the hours of chemical exposure, the physics of body heat betrayed me. The warmth of the moment released the bass notes I had tried to wash away. The heavy molecules of sandalwood, dark resin, and wood smoke detached from my skin and drifted across the sterile divide. Kinsley didn't scold me. She didn't check the data. She went absolutely still. Her hand froze in midair, the stylus hovering inches above the screen. Then, she did something impossible. She didn't pull away to reestablish the perimeter. She leaned in. It was a microscopic shift, a tilt of the head that bypassed conscious thought. Her eyes fluttered shut for a heartbeat, and her nose wrinkled slightly, the nostrils flaring as she tested the air. She wasn't analyzing a chemical sample. She was hunting a memory. The intake of breath was sharp, audible, a sudden disruption in the controlled rhythm of the room. She inhaled deeply, chasing the scent of midnight amber as it cut through the smell of bleach and ionized air. The silence that followed changed texture. It was no longer companionable. It was volatile. The air thickened, charged with a sudden, dangerous awareness. Kinsley turned her head slowly, lifting her eyes to mine. The usual cool, glazed detachment was gone. In its place was a look of raw, bewildered panic. Her pupils were blown wide, swallowing the green of her irises. She looked at me, really looked at me, not as a technician or a set of hands, but as a source of sensory input that she couldn't categorize. "That scent," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its usual polished cadence. It sounded like she hadn't used it in years. She didn't finish. She seemed to catch herself on the edge of the cliff, realizing exactly how far she had leaned over. The recognition in her eyes turned to horror as the professional implications crashed into the personal reaction. She blinked rapidly, the cold process slamming back into place with visible effort. She straightened her spine, stepping back from the bench as if I were radioactive. "The sample," she said. Her voice clipped, brittle, and entirely too loud. "Leave it. The data is sufficient for tonight." "But the cooling curve isn't—" "I said leave it," she snapped, turning her back to me to stare blindly at the monitors. Her hands were gripping the edge of the lab bench, her knuckles white. "Go home, Mia. That will be all." She dismissed me without looking back, but the air in the room had shifted permanently. The sterile seal was broken. As I walked to the decontamination airlock, my heart hammering against my ribs, I knew the invisible wall between us hadn't just cracked, it had shattered. And the smell of smoke and sandalwood was still lingering in the ruin. The next morning, the fluorescent lights felt brighter, sharper, as if an interrogation lamp had been turned on the entire room. The comfortable invisibility I had worn for 2 years was gone, burned away by a single moment of proximity. I walked in, scrubbed raw and red, paranoid that even a molecule of sandalwood remained on my skin, but the damage was already done. The variable had been introduced. Kinsley wasn't at her station. She was pacing. Not the thoughtful, rhythmic pacing of a scientist working through a formula, but the jagged, agitated movement of a caged animal. When I greeted her, she didn't just nod, she flinched. The air between us was no longer empty, it was pressurized. We worked, but the rhythm was broken. The silence was brittle, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Then, the impossible happened. Kinsley was transferring a reagent, a simple muscle memory task she had performed 10,000 times. Her hand spasmed. The test tube slipped from her fingers and shattered on the white tile floor. The sound of glass breaking in a silent lab was violent, a jagged tear in the fabric of the morning. Liquid pooled, hissing slightly against the grout. For a solid 10 seconds, neither of us moved. Dr. Kinsley Jones did not drop things. She did not make errors. To see her staring down at the broken glass with a look of genuine confusion was like watching gravity fail. I moved to clean it up, grabbing the hazard kit. "I've got it," I said, keeping my voice low. "Leave it," she said, echoing the night before, but with less anger and more exhaustion. She crouched down next to me, ignoring protocol, picking up a large shard with a gloved hand. "Mia." Her use of my first name felt foreign, a breach of the contract we had never signed, but always followed. "Yes, doctor? Where do you live?" I paused, dustpan in hand. "The West Village, near Christopher Street." She stopped moving. The shard of glass caught the light, trembling slightly in her grip. "And you take the subway?" "Yes." "It's a long commute." "It's fine. I like the neighborhood." She looked at me then, her eyes searching my face with an intensity that made my skin prickle. She was trying to solve an equation that didn't balance. She was trying to reconcile the sterile, silent technician she thought she knew with the sensory data from last night. She was looking for the variable, probing the edges of my life to see where the contamination came from. I was terrified. My internal monologue was screaming that I was about to be fired. I assumed this was an investigation into contamination. She had smelled the soap, identified a breach of the neutral scent clause in my contract, and was now gathering evidence to terminate my employment. I kept my answers short, defensive, terrified that I had ruined the best job I would ever have over a bar of soap. "I need the file on the lipid stability trials from 2018, she said suddenly, standing up and stripping off her gloves with sharp, jerky movements. "It's in my office, on the desk. Go get it." I froze. The inner sanctum. Junior technicians did not go into Dr. Jones's private office. That was a rule as hard as the one about open-toed shoes. "Now, Mia." I walked down the corridor, my heart thudding against my ribs. Her office door was heavy, solid oak, the only organic material in the entire wing. I pushed it open. The room was a shock. I expected a continuation of the lab, chrome, white, sterile. Instead, it was dark. The blinds were drawn against the morning sun. The furniture was sleek but severe. It was a space of absolute isolation. The file was exactly where she said it would be, sitting on a pristine glass desk that looked like it had never been used. I reached for the folder, my hand trembling slightly. As I turned to leave, a glint of light caught my eye. The door to her private ensuite washroom was ajar. It was just a crack, a sliver of space, but the angle was perfect. I should have kept walking. I should have respected the boundary. But curiosity is a physical force. I took a step closer, peering through the gap. The washroom was standard institute issue. White sink, white tile, chrome faucet. But sitting on the edge of the porcelain basin, resting on a small, dark stone dish, was a bar of soap. It wasn't the pink industrial foam. It wasn't the white clinical bar. It was a rough-cut block of dark gold. It was worn down, the edges softened by water and hands, curved into a shape that fit a specific palm. Even from the doorway, I could see the flecks of resin trapped in the amber matrix. Midnight amber. The world tilted on its axis. It wasn't just a similar soap. It was the soap. The artisanal import from the tiny shop on Fifth that cost too much and smelled like smoke and secrets. The soap I used to feel human. The soap I thought was my private rebellion against her world. She wasn't investigating me for contamination. She was investigating me because I smelled like her secret. I smelled like the one thing she kept hidden behind the heavy oak door. I stared at the bar of soap, and the pieces of Kinsley Jones rearranged themselves in my mind. The coldness wasn't just a personality trait. It was armor. And under the armor, she was washing her hands with the same scent of wood smoke and longing that I scrubbed into my skin every morning. We weren't opposites. We were mirrors. The walk back from her office felt like moving through a different atmospheric pressure. The file folder in my hand was heavy, but the knowledge I carried was heavier. It wasn't just soap. If it had been a generic floral brand or something clinically expensive, it wouldn't have mattered. But Midnight Amber was a choice. It was a deliberate seek-and-find mission for something that smelled like the opposite of this building. That she used it. That the woman who built a cathedral to sterility secretly washed her hands with the scent of a burning hearth meant that her psychology mirrored mine. We were both starving. We were both smuggling warmth into a cold world, hiding it in the creases of our skin. The soap was a totem. It changed the equation from subordinate and superior to accomplice and accomplice. I realized then that the cold process wasn't just her nature. It was a performance. It was a dam she had built to hold back a reservoir of intensity that she didn't trust herself to manage. And I had just found the crack in the concrete. I re-entered the lab. Kinsley was standing by the spectrometer, her back rigid, staring at a readout she clearly wasn't reading. I approached her slowly. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was thick, textured with the secret she didn't know I knew. "The file, doctor," I said. She turned. She reached for the folder. In the past, this transfer would have been executed with surgical avoidance, her hand taking the corner furthest from mine. Today, her spatial awareness faltered. Her fingers closed over the folder and collided with mine. My thumb pressed against the side of her palm, skin against skin. It was a shock of static. Yesterday, she would have recoiled as if I were a contaminant. Today, she froze. She looked down at our hands, tethered together by the manila cardstock. She didn't pull away. She let the contact linger, her thumb brushing the side of my index finger, a micro movement that felt deafeningly loud. For 3 seconds, the hierarchy dissolved. There was just heat and the sudden, terrifying realization that she didn't want to let go. "Thank you," she said, her voice dropping an octave, a rougher texture than her usual polished tone. She pulled the file away slowly, the friction audible in the quiet room. "We need to profile the base," she said abruptly, turning back to the bench. She needed a task. She needed to ground the electricity in the room before it arced. "The new lipid chain. It has an intrinsic odor. We need to determine if it requires a masking agent." This was dangerous ground. Scent evaluation is the most subjective part of our work. It requires language that is inherently unscientific. It forces you to talk about feelings, about associations, about memory. She uncapped the beaker of the raw emulsion and wafted the air toward her face, closing her eyes. I watched the tension leave her forehead. I watched her lips part slightly, her chest rising as she inhaled. It was an intimate act, watching her breathe. "It's sterile," she murmured, eyes still closed. "Metallic. Cold. It lacks humanity." She opened her eyes and held the beaker out to me. "What do you get? You have sensitive receptors." It was a test, not of my olfactory nerves, but of my willingness to step into the ring with her. I stepped into her space. I didn't take the beaker. I leaned down, bringing my face close to her hand, close to the glass rim. I was close enough to see the gold flecks in her green eyes, close enough to smell the faint, underlying chemical tang of the lab coat she wore. I inhaled. "It's lonely," I said. The word hung there, suspended in the filtered air. It wasn't a chemical descriptor. It was a diagnostic of the room. Kinsley didn't correct me. She didn't demand a technical term like astringent or mineral. She stared at me, her gaze dropping to my mouth, then back up to my eyes. "Lonely," she repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, it has no foundation. It needs a bass note to anchor it." "Something warm," I suggested, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something to counteract the antiseptic, to make it feel lived in." "Like amber?" she asked. The air left the room. It was a direct hit. She wasn't talking about the formula anymore. She was acknowledging the elephant in the room, the scent that had started this avalanche. "Like amber," I agreed, holding her gaze, refusing to blink. "And smoke. Something that proves it's been through the fire." She set the beaker down, her movements slow, hypnotic. She was watching my lips move. The heat in the lab seemed to spike 10 degrees. The ventilation system hummed, oblivious to the fact that the two people in the room were circling a drain of inevitable collision. "I value your input, Mia," she said softly. "You see things I miss. You feel things I suppress." It was the first compliment she had ever given me that wasn't about data entry. It felt like she had reached out and touched my face. "I just pay attention to the details, Kinsley." I used her first name again. It slipped out, a test of the new boundary. She didn't correct me. She just breathed in, a shallow, shaky breath. The wall was still there. She was still the mentor, the genius, the boss. But the glass was thinning. I could see the woman on the other side now, and I knew for a fact she was looking right back at me, terrified and hungry. The high didn't last. Chemistry is a cruel mistress, entirely indifferent to emotional breakthroughs or the tentative bridging of human distance. 2 hours later, the centrifuge spun down, and the machine didn't chime with the cheerful ping of completion. It buzzed. A low, angry drone that signaled an error, vibrating through the stainless steel bench and straight into my teeth. We rushed to the machine, the earlier intimacy evaporating under the sudden glare of crisis. Kinsley pulled the sample tube from the rotor. It should have been a uniform, creamy white, a perfect marriage of phases held together by our careful engineering. It wasn't. It was broken. A layer of clear mockery oil sat distinctly on top of a cloudy water base, with a jagged line of separation between them. Phase separation. Total failure. The silence that followed wasn't charged. It was dead. It was the sound of 6 months of work dissolving into useless sludge. "It broke," Kinsley whispered. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking translucent under the harsh lights. "It broke. The shear stress was too high. The HLB value is wrong. It's all wrong." She didn't put the tube down. She gripped it until her knuckles turned the color of bone, threatening to shatter the glass in her bare hand. Then she started to pace. This wasn't the thoughtful, rhythmic pacing of a scientist working through a problem. This was a spiral. She walked a tight, jagged circle between the bench and the fume hood, muttering variables, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "I can't restart," she said, her voice rising, cracking on the edges. "The board review is Monday. This was the final stability check. If this fails, the grant pulls out. If the grant pulls out, the lab..." She stopped, running a hand through her hair, pulling strands loose from her perfect, severe bun. "I failed. I missed a variable. How did I miss a variable?" The cold process was gone. In her place was a woman standing in the wreckage of her own perfectionism, terrified of the fall. She looked small. She looked like she was drowning in the white air of the room, the data crushing her. It was terrifying to witness, because I realized her composure wasn't strength. It was a high-tension wire, and it had just snapped. I couldn't watch it. The satellite orbit collapsed. I didn't think about my pay grade. I didn't think about HR protocols or the hierarchy that defined our lives. I stepped out of the background. I stepped into her path. I planted my feet on the white tile, making myself an immovable object. She almost ran into me. She stopped inches from my chest, her momentum checking hard against my presence. Her eyes were wild, unfocused, darting around the room as if the answer was written on the walls. "Dr. Jones," I said. She tried to step around me, her body vibrating with the need to move, to fix, to run. I moved with her, blocking her exit. "Kinsley," the name stopped her. It acted like a physical barrier. She looked up, startled by the obstruction, blinking as if waking from a nightmare. "Move, Mia. I need to check the raw materials. I need to recalibrate the..." "Stop," I said. My voice was steady, grounded, a stark contrast to her frenetic vibration. I stepped closer, invading her personal space until I was the only thing she could see. "You didn't miss a variable. The shear stress wasn't too high. It was the temperature ramp. We cooled it too fast. The crystal structure didn't have time to set." She stared at me, her chest heaving, the smell of fear radiating off her. "The cooling curve was standard." "For a standard emulsion," I corrected, holding her gaze, refusing to let her look away. "This isn't standard. It's heavy. It needs time. We don't need to scrap it. We need to reheat the aqueous phase, re-emulsify, and drop the cooling rate by 2 degrees per minute." I was speaking her language, but I was standing in her personal space. The scent of midnight amber, faint now, fading after the long shift, but still present, drifted between us. It acted like a tether, snapping her back to reality. "We can fix this," I said, softer now, lowering my voice to a register that was meant only for her. "We have the materials. We have the time. But only if you stop panicking and start mixing." The panic in her eyes didn't vanish, but it transmuted. It turned into focus. She looked at my mouth, then my eyes. She realized I wasn't just cleaning up her mess. I was solving it. The fear melted into something else. Relief, and under that, a raw, naked hunger. She looked at me like I was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to liquid. Her defenses were down, the drawbridge lowered, and for the first time, I saw the depth of the need she kept hidden behind the data. Reheat the aqueous phase, she repeated, her voice steadying, latching onto the plan. Yes? 2 degrees per minute. Yes. She took a deep breath, inhaling the air I occupied, grounding herself in my proximity. Okay. She didn't step back. For a long moment, we just stood there. The broken test tube between us, the hierarchy forgotten. Then she nodded, a sharp, decisive movement. Prep the hot plate, she said, her eyes still locked on mine. Let's save it. The centrifuge chimed at 2:07 a.m. It wasn't the angry buzz of failure this time. It was the polite, musical ping of completion. We stood over the machine like parents over a crib, terrified to look, terrified not to. Kinsley popped the lid. Inside, the sample tube was perfect. The emulsion was a smooth, opaque cream, glossy and unified. The oil and water had stopped fighting and learned to coexist. We had forced the chemistry to yield. The relief didn't hit me like a wave. It hit me like a physical blow. My knees actually buckled, just for a fraction of a second, and I had to grab the edge of the bench. Kinsley let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in her lungs since Monday. She didn't smile. Smiling was too much effort. But the rigid tension in her shoulders collapsed. The cold process had survived, but the woman underneath was running on fumes. Coffee, she said. It wasn't a request. It was a medical necessity. We retreated to the break room, a windowless box of beige linoleum and fluorescent despair that felt like an airlock between the lab and the real world. It was the only place in the institute that wasn't beautiful. The vending machine hummed with a broken, rattling fan, and the plastic chairs were designed to be uncomfortable enough to discourage lingering. We sat opposite each other at the small, wobbly table, 2 survivors of a shipwreck washing up on a plastic island. For 5 minutes, we didn't speak. We just sat in the quiet, drinking terrible, burnt coffee from paper cups, the silence heavy with exhaustion. But it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the sterile void of the lab. It was intimate. It was the silence of 2 people who had just fought a war together and won. Kinsley was staring into her coffee, watching the steam rise. Without looking up, she spoke. The apothecary on 5th and Perry. I froze, my cup halfway to my mouth. Excuse me? She looked up then, her eyes rimmed with red, but clear. The soap. You get it from the apothecary on 5th, the one with the dried herbs in the window and the owner who never speaks. I set my cup down slowly. Yes, that's the one. She nodded, a small, private movement. I found that shop 6 years ago. I was burning out. I needed something that didn't smell like ethanol and ambition. I bought a bar of midnight amber because it smelled like a fireplace. It smelled like a home I didn't have time to maintain. She traced the rim of her cup with a long, elegant finger. I thought it was my secret. I thought it was the one thing in my life that wasn't subject to peer review or FDA approval. It was my armor. I wash with it, and for 10 minutes, I'm not Dr. Jones. I'm just a person. A person who likes wood smoke and warmth. The admission hung in the air, fragile and heavy. She was handing me the keys to her psychology. By using the same soap, I hadn't just breached protocol. I had accidentally invaded her sanctuary. I was walking around wearing her armor. Every time she smelled me, she was smelling her own private escape. I use it for the same reason, I said softly. The lab, it can be erasing. I needed something to remind me that I exist outside of the data. Kinsley laughed, a dry, humorless sound. And here I thought you were just a dedicated technician. I didn't realize you were also fighting to keep from disappearing. We're all fighting something, Kinsley. She looked at me then, really looked at me, stripped of the mentor facade. In the harsh fluorescent light, she looked lonely. Not the professional solitude of a leader, but the deep, aching loneliness of someone who has built a fortress so high that no one can climb the walls. When I smelled it on you, she whispered, leaning forward slightly, it terrified me because it felt like you were already inside. It felt like you knew me in a way you weren't supposed to. It was disorienting to look at a subordinate and smell my own secret. The tension in the room spiked. This was it. The door was open. The professional distance had been dissolved by exhaustion and sandalwood. I could see the pulse jumping in her throat. I could feel the magnetic pull between us, the inevitable gravity of two bodies that had been orbiting each other for too long. Maybe I do know you, I said, my voice barely audible over the hum of the vending machine. Maybe I see more than you think. Her gaze dropped to my lips, then snapped back to my eyes. For a second, I thought she was going to reach across the wobbly table. I thought she was going to cover my hand with hers and acknowledge that the chemistry wasn't just in the beaker. But then, the fear returned. The cold process kicked in, a survival mechanism honed over decades. She blinked, sat back, and the wall slammed down. We should go, she said, her voice suddenly crisp, the moment severed. The data needs to be logged before we leave. She stood up, leaving her coffee unfinished. She was the mentor again, retreating to the safety of the hierarchy. But as she walked to the door, I saw her hand tremble. She wouldn't cross the line. She couldn't. If this was going to happen, I realized with a sinking heart, I was going to have to be the one to break the rules. I was going to have to be the variable she couldn't control. We packed up in silence, the rhythm of our movements returning to a semblance of the old routine, but the frequency was wrong. Every click of a latch, every rustle of a trash bag felt amplified, echoing in the cavernous, empty lab. The difficult emulsion was safely stored in the incubator, stabilizing at its new, gentler temperature, but the stability in the room was gone. We were two volatile elements that had been shaken together, and now we were trying to separate back into our distinct phases before the sun came up. I watched Kinsley move toward the heavy steel doors that marked the exit of the sterile zone. She had put her jacket back on, buttoning it all the way to the chin, rebuilding the fortress. Her spine was rigid, her stride purposeful. She was walking away from the mess we had made, walking back toward the safety of her title and her solitude. If she walked through those doors, the night would calcify into an anecdote. It would become a story she told herself about a close call with a batch of cream, edited to remove the terrifying intimacy of the break room. We would return to being the statue and the satellite, orbiting in silence until one of us burned out. I couldn't let that happen. The fear of losing my job was a sharp, cold knot in my stomach. But the fear of returning to the silence was worse. I had seen the woman behind the data, and I couldn't unsee her. I couldn't go back to pretending she was just a boss when I knew she washed her hands with the same smoke and longing that I did. Dr. Jones. My voice sounded too loud in the quiet corridor. She didn't stop. Her hand reached for the push bar on the door. She was going to ignore it. She was going to pretend she didn't hear the desperation in my tone. Kinsley. The name hit the air like a physical obstruction. It wasn't a request. It was a collision. She stopped dead, her hand hovering inches from the metal bar. Her shoulders went rigid, telegraphing the shock of hearing her first name spoken in this hallway, in this voice, at this hour. She didn't turn around immediately. For a long, agonizing second, we just stood there, suspended in the amber light of the emergency exit signs. It's not just the soap, I said. The words came out in a rush, reckless and necessary. I was burning the bridge while I was still standing on it. You think I bought it to hide? Maybe at first. But you think I'm standing here, risking my career, just because we happen to use the same brand of sandalwood wash? It's not the soap, Kinsley. It's you. She turned then, slowly, reluctantly. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and dark, stripped of the professional glazing she usually wore like a shield. She looked terrified. "Mia," she warned, her voice trembling, "be very careful what you say next." "I'm done being careful," I said, taking a step toward her. The distance between us felt charged, thick with the static of everything we hadn't said for 2 years. "I've been watching you. Not just the scientist. I see the way you check the safety seals 3 times when you're anxious. I see the way you look at the city skyline when you think no one is watching, searching for a pattern in the chaos. I see how you rub your left temple when the data doesn't make sense. I see how lonely it is at the top of the mountain you built." She took a sharp breath, pressing her back against the steel door, as if trying to merge with the metal. "You don't know what you're saying. This is inappropriate. It's against every protocol in the handbook." "I know the protocol," I countered, stepping closer, ignoring the alarm bells ringing in my head. "I know the hierarchy. I know I'm supposed to be invisible. I know I'm supposed to be the hands that hand you the pipette and nothing more. But last night, when you smelled that soap, you didn't pull away. You leaned in. You wanted to know. And tonight, when our hands touched on that file, you didn't let go. You held on." "I was tired," she whispered, the excuse flimsy and desperate. "It was a lapse in judgment." "Was it?" I challenged. I was close now, invading the personal space she guarded so fiercely. I could see the pulse jumping in the hollow of her throat. I could smell the faint, fading notes of the sandalwood on her skin, mixing with the sterile air of the corridor. Because it felt like the first honest thing that's happened in this building in 10 years. She stared at me, her chest heaving, trapped between the safety of the door and the danger of me. The cold process was melting, running like water, revealing the raw, terrified woman underneath. She wanted to run. I could see it in her eyes. But she was rooted to the spot by the same gravity that had pulled me in. "Tell me to stop," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. I stood right on the line, close enough to feel the heat radiating off her. "Tell me this is just a chemical reaction. Tell me I'm imagining the way you look at me. Tell me you don't feel the same pull. Tell me to go home, Kinsley, and I will walk away and never mention this again. But you have to tell me." She looked at me, her lips parted, her eyes searching mine for an escape route. She took a breath to speak, to order me back, to reinstate the rules and fire me for insubordination. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, waiting for her command. But the words didn't come. She didn't tell me to stop. The command never came. Instead, the tension that had been holding her upright seemed to snap, not with a bang, but with a long, shuddering exhale. It was the sound of a structure finally settling into the earth, the surrender of a general who had run out of ammunition and realized the war was over. "I can't," she whispered, the words barely carrying across the few inches between us. "I can't tell you to stop. I've been trying to tell myself to stop for a year, and it hasn't worked." The admission hung in the corridor, more volatile than any chemical we kept in the hazardous materials locker. Kinsley looked at me, her eyes searching my face with a terrifying openness. Then she moved. It wasn't the sharp, efficient movement of Dr. Jones reaching for a scalpel or a pipette. It was slow, tentative, trembling with a hesitation I had never seen in her hands before. She reached out and touched my face. Her fingers were cool and dry against my skin. She traced the line of my jaw, her touch feather light, as if she were calibrating a delicate instrument and terrified of throwing it off balance. She wasn't checking for data. She was checking for reality. She was grounding herself in the physical fact of my presence. "You have no idea," she murmured, her gaze tracking the movement of her own hand on my skin. "Every morning, I walk into this building and it's white and it's cold and it's dead. It's a vacuum. And then you walk past me to check the incubators, and for 3 seconds, the air smells like life. like a fire in a hearth I'm not allowed to sit by. It drove me crazy, Mia. It made me want things I decided a long time ago I wasn't allowed to have. You're allowed, I said, leaning into her touch, closing the final millimeter of distance between her palm and my cheek. You don't have to freeze to be brilliant, Kinsley. You don't have to be the ice queen just to survive the lab. I thought I did, she confessed, her thumb brushing over my cheekbone. I thought if I let any warmth in, the discipline would crumble. I thought the cold process was the only way to ensure the product didn't break. The product broke anyway, I reminded her, softy, and we fixed it with heat. We fixed it by letting it warm up. She let out a short, breathless laugh that sounded like a sob. We did, didn't we? In chemistry, saponification is the reaction that turns fat and lye into soap. It's a one-way process. Once the heat is applied and the bond is formed, you cannot reverse it. You cannot separate the soap back into its raw ingredients. The change is permanent. Standing there in the dim light of the hallway, I felt that reaction taking hold. The hierarchy, the rigid, crystalline structure of mentor and subordinate, of genius and satellite, had dissolved. We were no longer defined by our roles in the lab. We were just two women standing in the dark, tired and terrified, and drawn together by a magnetism that defied the employee handbook. The power dynamic had flipped, or perhaps it had finally leveled. She was vulnerable, stripped of her armor, shaking in her expensive shoes. I was the steady one. I was the bass note, holding the volatile top notes from evaporating. This is complicated, she said, her voice regaining a fraction of its usual steadiness, though she didn't pull her hand away. The Institute, HR, the rumors. If we do this, if I let this happen, it's going to be a mess. It's already a mess, I countered. We're standing in the emergency exit at 3 a.m. holding hands. The mess is already here. The question is whether we clean it up and go back to being miserable, or if we figure out a new formula. She looked at me, the fear in her green eyes slowly receding, replaced by a steely resolve. The same look she got when she was about to solve an impossible equation. She nodded, once. A new formula, she agreed. I suppose I've always enjoyed a challenge. She dropped her hand from my face, but she didn't step back. She reached down and found my hand in the dark, interlacing her fingers with mine. Her grip was firm, possessive. It was an anchor. Let's go, she said. I can't look at another white tile tonight. We walked to the heavy steel doors together. We didn't walk as a boss leading an employee. We walked shoulder to shoulder, our strides matching, the silence between us filled with the promise of everything we hadn't said yet. We pushed the crash bar together. The heavy lab door clicked shut behind us with a finality that echoed in the empty street, sealing the sterile, white world of the Jones Institute inside. We stepped out into the cool night air, which smelled of rain, wet asphalt, and possibility, messy and real. In the darkness of the parking lot, her hand brushed mine again, deliberate and lingering. If you want to see how we rewrite the protocol, subscribe to Follow the Journey. The chemistry has changed forever.